Hi, everyone. We're going to give just one moment for folks to keep joining the webinar before we get started. But we have people joining and we're super excited. Okay. I think it is, I think it's slowed down. I think we can go ahead and we'll start with introductions today so that we can make sure that we're staying within the time that we've allotted and respect everybody's schedules today. Um, so Welcome everyone to this webinar titled Public Engagement Pedagogy Across the Methods Curriculum, hosted by First Publics. So for those of you that are new to this space, First Publics provides a space to explore the politics, pedagogy, and practice of teaching as public sociology. We publish first-person reflections on the embodied and experiential aspects of teaching as public sociology, and we create dialogues on timely topics and long-standing concerns related to teaching as public sociology. This year, with the generous support of the American Sociological Association's Carla B. Howery Teaching Enhancement Fund, we've been producing content including webinars like this on the topic of methods as public sociology. This year, we've hosted 2 webinars thus far on teaching methods in times of crisis, as well as methods for as public engagement. If you missed these previous webinars, never fear, they are posted on our site under the Dialogues tab, along with written reflections from our team. But today, we're very excited to extend these discussions with 2 fabulous sociologists who teach and have taught methods, but are also concerned with the ways that we can make methods more accessible and how these skills translate outside of the classroom. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Vanessa Gonlin, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Georgia, where she studies racial identities, colorism, and interracial relationships with a particular focus on Black people and multiracials. In addition to her research, Dr. Gonlin is an award-winning teacher scholar, having been recognized through the UGA Franklin College of Arts and Sciences Outstanding Teaching Award, UGA NAACP Mary McLeod Bethune Educator Award, the Sandy Beaver Excellence in Teaching Award, the Multicultural Curriculum Grant, and the Lilly Teaching Fellowship. So thank you so much, Vanessa, for being here with us. We'll also hear from Jennifer Turner. Dr. Turner is a senior research associate at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, where she works to break down barriers to education for student parents and advance inclusive, equitable workplaces for Black women. Prior to her time at IWPR, excuse me, she worked as a... Can everybody hear me now? I got a message that I froze.
Yeah, there's been some freezing. So, like sometimes, I don't know about for you, it helps me to close other windows. I don't know if you have any other windows open or anything, but it helps me to make sure that I close all of those. I don't know if that might help your bandwidth.
Let's go ahead and do that. All right. How am I doing now? Okay? Okay, great. Please, again, let me know if I freeze again. Thank you. So Dr. Turner, prior to her time at IWPR, she worked as an assistant professor of sociology at Hollins University, where she directed the sociology program and taught courses on a variety of topics, including gender, family, and reproductive justice. She is committed to making research accessible and actionable, engaging audiences ranging from policymakers to practitioners with insights that drive systemic change. So thank you, Vanessa and Jennifer. We're very excited for this conversation today. So as we've discussed in our previous webinars, the role of methods during the current moment, but also for public engagement, we've touched on some of the ways we approach the practice of teaching methods. So we're hoping today to begin with a more direct discussion about strategies for helping students engage with the process and challenge of methods. So, Vanessa, if you're all right, I'll begin our conversation today by asking you about how you invite learners to accept the challenge of methods, reducing those anxieties around learning methods that students often bring to methods courses. And maybe an extension of this question is, how do we prime and prepare our students for the experience?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Steph. And also, I'm just really excited to be here today to have the opportunity to engage with you all and also with Jennifer or Dr. Turner. I'm excited for the conversation that we're going to have. So, to your question about helping students to engage with the process and challenge of methods and to help prepare students, I start every class that I teach with mindfulness meditation. So we'll start with 3 to 5 minutes every day. And this will be at the beginning of the class. And so I'll welcome students in, let them know that here's our schedule for today, and then we're going to do a little bit of breathing. And I found that this is incredibly helpful for students because I teach statistics and quantitative methods. And so sometimes people will enter this space with trepidation. Maybe they have had some experiences in the past that lead them to have maybe math anxiety. And so I think that starting off by engaging in breathing, grounding, centering ourselves, finding peace and serenity within ourselves, knowing we can always come to ourselves for support and stability at any time during this process is, I think, a really good way to start off. So in addition to the actual action of mindfulness meditation, it also lets my students know that I value them and their well-being and their mental health. In addition to their ability to perform, they're not just here to perform, they're also here to take care of themselves in different ways, such as through breathing and meditating. So I'll start off with that, and I can go more into detail with that or with other things that I do, but I will just start off by saying I have every class period with mindfulness meditation to help address any potential math anxiety people might be feeling.
Thank you so much. It's such a great strategy, and something that I would love to implement in my own courses. Jennifer, I'll turn to you now. Can you discuss any additional strategies for preparing students to engage with methods from your own experience teaching, but even more, how these strategies for learning and approaching methods can or have translated into your work at IWPR? So, in what ways are we creating lifelong learners across settings, and where does methods fit in this process?
Great question. Thank you. And also thank you, Vanessa, for your response. I also used to sometimes use mindfulness meditation in my courses as well when I was a professor. So I love that. I think it's super important to ground folks. And then also to like throughout class, maybe doing a check-in with people too, depending on the topics and things like especially statistics probably. So I am more of a qualitative researcher. And so in my previous role as an assistant professor at Hollins University, I used to teach a qualitative methods course. And then in my current work at IWPR, I train researchers on qualitative methods, particularly interviewing, as well as how to use Deduce, which is a qualitative data analysis software. And so for me, one of the biggest strategies, I guess, was to kind of help students understand that methods are tools to help them understand the world. So really like demystifying what methods are and having them apply methods to their lives in a very real way. So one of the exercises I would do with my qualitative method students is have them go to the student center on campus and do like field notes and observations, and just have them think critically about how we observe this, like, because we're always observing the social world, right? So one of the things I think methods, particularly qualitative methods, are really valuable for is helping students think more critically about the social world as they're engaging with it. And in my gender class that I used to teach, I would have students have a gender journal. And it was a way for them to be reflexive about the ways in which gender shapes their everyday lives. And so reflexivity to that point is really important as well. Just having students understand their positionality in the social world and how that shapes our perceptions of the social world and the way we interact with it. But really, I think starting with the why of why we're doing this thing, like I said, demystifying it, and helping them understand how we can apply these tools to their lives more broadly is important. And in the context of IWPR, it's important because we very much engage in public facing research. So it's important to help people to develop skills like active listening, being able to translate complex research findings to a broad audience. All of those things are things that I focus on.
Great. I love that. I love the why and this component of reflexivity. And I think that how can we use these beyond the classroom? I think that's a great transition into one of the next questions that I have for us, which is, at First Publix, we are concerned with attending to the needs of diverse publics who enter the classroom. And that this is done via our pedagogy and our practice. So, and both of you have significant research and teaching agendas that attend to issues of inclusivity and equity. And our view is that it's not just substantive area knowledge on race or inequality that helps us engage productively in the political conversation about DEI, but also the skills and sensibilities around methods. So maybe Jennifer, if we might begin with you, how do you see the space for methods training within this conversation? How can a grounding in sociological research methods help students or graduates engage in the work of equity or inclusion?
Yeah, I love this question. I think going back to kind of something I brought up a minute ago, understanding positionality is something that particularly qualitative research methods are really important for and really useful for. And so I like to think of myself as an intersectional qualitative researcher. So thinking about how systems of power and how our social identities interact when we're engaging in research. We know that when we're doing research, there's already a power dynamic between the researcher and the research participant. How do we deconstruct that? It's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. How can we engage with our communities in a way that is respectful, not as not transactional as possible. There's some transactional nature to it, but trying to break that down as well. Understanding our collective responsibility to one another is really important. And then not looking at research as a one-way street, but also considering how participants are experts on their own lived experience as well. But for me, it really starts with, like I said, that positionality and being reflexive about our own identities and the role that those things play in the research process and in the way in which we engage with the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. And do you feel as though that your continued engagement in this research area and these issues has changed your way of using methods or has informed the ways that you use methods?
When you say this way, do you mean intersectional qualitative research or do you
Or
mean
or the way that you approach
okay,
methods? Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because working in the context of a think tank, so Institute for Women's Policy Research is a think tank. Um, it's not the same as working in academia in the sense that I don't have the latitude that I had before to like kind of engage in research in my own way. And we often have really tight timelines on research projects. So I wish that I could be more like, and I wish that I could engage more with the communities that we study. I wish that I could pull in more of that collective responsibility piece and reciprocity and things like that. But unfortunately, due to the nature of the work, I can't. But so I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but
Well, I think that's really helpful for us to understand, the different positions that we are in and then
yeah.
the opportunities that we're afforded, but, still striving to use the best methods um,
Exactly. Yeah. And also, I work with a lot of economists and mostly quantitative researchers who have never, they may have used qualitative research before, but they don't have a ton of experience with it, and some don't have any experience with it at all. So that's made me be more critical of my own research practices. And, when we're teaching someone about something, we are also learning as well, and kind of like it's an iterative process. So I've just had to do a lot of thinking around these things. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And Vanessa, I'd also love to hear your thoughts on this question. How can a grounding in sociological research methods help students engage in the work of equity and inclusion?
Absolutely. So I think that Jennifer hit the nail on the head, focusing on positionality. And from a quantitative perspective, the way that I engage in this is having my students do critical reflexivity statements, which sounds similar actually to what Jennifer does too. But critical reflexivity in like a quantitative methods arena would be more like, what questions are you asking? Who's funding the research that you're doing? What's the question order that you have? Like, how do you, if you're doing gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, how do you ask these questions on a survey in a way that people understand and is also like supportive of their identities, but still clear to how they're understanding themselves? So thinking about that, thinking about the positions that someone brings to the table and how they might interpret survey data differently based on the way that they are reading questions, which might be different from how participants are understanding the survey. So thinking about that. I also come from a quant crit perspective. Quant crit is it builds on critical race theory. And so quant crit is basically saying, let's consider the limitations and some of the weaknesses of quantitative methods that have been lauded against different like quantitative scholars. And let's consider how we can actually address this and be more supportive of the communities that we want to study. So quant crit kind of changes the focus, where some quantitative methodologists might say, this sample is too small, and so we're not going to analyze this data, which makes sense because you want to protect people's identities. From a quant crit perspective, we might say, that's understandable. However, then you're missing a lot of information about some maybe minoritized communities because you're not able to analyze the data. So we try to think more creatively about how to get this information and still be protecting of people's identities while still making sure to have access to this information too. So I'll just note those two things. Oh, I will also actually say that in addition to thinking about how someone might approach the research, I also think that engaging in this um, can help you think about just having more critical lens on data more broadly. So even if you're not collecting data or analyzing data, it might lead you to, if you're reading an article or something, have a more critical lens, asking like, well, who funded this research and what were the questions, and maybe the order of the questions matters too. And was this in person? If it's in person, that matters too, because then the way that respondents interact with whoever their surveyor is depends on your identities. If it's not in person, if it's online, does everyone have access to this online space? So I think it leads people to have a more critical lens on the work that they read, even if they are not engaging in data collection or analyses themselves.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you both. And I think, this lends itself to the next thing that we'd like to talk about, which is about some of these like nuts and bolts of what's happening in the classroom. What are the skills we're hoping and the knowledge that students are getting and the knowledge that are imparting. Um, and I think this will also come back to what you were saying, Jennifer, about your experience at IWPR, and give you an opportunity to further elaborate on that because I think that's a super interesting part of this conversation. Um, so focusing on the methodological skills and sensibilities that matter for the public and applied work, we as many of us are aware, most students who come through our undergraduate classrooms are not planning careers as professional academic sociologists. Um, so, how do we think about our students in terms of the publics they represent when we teach methods? And then in that light, what methodological skills and sensibilities do we hope to impart and why? So Vanessa, if you wouldn't mind starting us off with discussing, how do we think about our students in the classroom? What skills and sensibilities are you hoping to impart?
Sure. So I think it would matter a lot depending on what their career goals or future plans would entail, because that would shape what is most useful for them. So I think that, for example, maybe they're going into survey design, then I would want to focus more on that. Maybe they're doing big data, then I would want them to focus more on like, if you're not collecting the data, how do you analyze data that others have collected? If you're dropping people from a survey, do you have a reason for why you're dropping them? Like I would want to think about what their goals are and the strategies that they anticipate using in their future careers. And my overarching goal, regardless, though, would be to have people engaging with data more critically than they might have otherwise. That would be like an ultimate goal, to think about like not just what we're doing, but why we're doing it and the different potential outcomes that we can have depending on the way that we ask questions, the order of the questions, etc.
Thank you. And so, in an extension of this, how does this shape the assignments and activities and assessments that you design for your courses?
To engage as well. So sometimes I think that we think that there's like one right answer, but there can be many right answers, or many not even right, but just different answers. So for example, if you are asking about race and ethnicity in a survey, people can have very different perspectives on the best way to do it. So this might impact the way that I have students engage with this. I generally have my students do a fishbowl, multiple fishbowl activities in which they there's like a group of students who respond to a prompt, and there's no right or wrong answer for the prompt, but everyone in the class is just watching and witnessing as they respond. And then afterwards, it'll go to another group, and then they'll do the same thing, etc. So generally, I will have them think of how they would ask about race or ethnicity on a survey. So if they're creating their own survey, how would they would do that? If they're creating their own survey, how would they ask about gender? How would they ask about sexual orientation? And then I would also give them examples like we have the census. Let's say we're using 2020 census data. They already have a race and ethnicity question. How would you use this information? And then also another example would be, what if you're doing something longitudinally? We have 2010 and 2020 race and ethnicity asked on the census, and every single census we have, race and ethnicity is asked differently. So if you want to do a longitudinal study, how would you do that? And so again, there's no clear right or wrong answer. I just want students to think about the strengths and limitations of their choices and be able to explain their rationale for why they put some groups together, why they disaggregated some groups. I just want them to be thinking about how they are approaching this data. So fishbowl would be one example. I also have them do a critical reflexivity assignment as well, as we discussed earlier. That would be one of their assignments too. So those are just like two examples of different activities that I would have them engage with. Also, I will note real quick that before I have them like do the fishbowl, then I provide different examples of ways that gender is asked, sexual orientation is asked, race is asked, ethnicity asked, etc. So I'll provide different examples to show like this great resource asked about this exact same question very differently than this other great resource. And so what are you going to do when you go forward for your own survey design? Or if you're using other people's data, how do you navigate that? And so I want them to think about that and consider the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches.
Thanks so much. I love the active learning component and this extending what methods can mean in terms of the skills that we're learning, like evaluating data and the research that we're consuming and learning those skills. Thanks so much. And Jennifer, I'd love to know your thoughts on this as well, but also from the standpoint of working in an academy adjacent position, right? So could you speak to those skills or what kinds of methods and or nuts and bolts skills you're looking for when building a research team?
Hmm. Yeah, well, first, I really want to amplify something that Vanessa said, which was kind of like understanding who your students are and what their interests are. I think that's really important. So, like you mentioned, Stephanie, like most students don't want to go into academic sociology careers, but maybe they want to go into business or HR or something like that. And I think that the skills that we're teaching are useful in any career, especially when we're talking about critical analysis of information, um, thinking about like what questions you want to ask to understand a problem. Um, I know in the context of qualitative interviewing, being an active listener, those kinds of things are really important. We talked about reflexivity a lot. So I think that's an important skill to have across any career, understanding your position, how it shapes your perception, and how it shapes your interaction with the world. Um, that can help us when we're interacting one on one with people in general. And let's see, what else would I say? I would say also maybe trying to help students. I think, too, like Vanessa said, something about it's not always about having the right answer. I think, too, like getting comfortable or helping students get comfortable with asking questions and knowing that you don't always have to have the right answer. Sometimes it's important to know more important to know what questions to ask than it is to have all the answers. And then in terms of building a research team, this is something that I haven't had to build my own research team per se, but I've had to think about like who would be the best researcher to work on a specific project. So I would say intellectual curiosity, kind of like a genuine interest in whatever the research topic is. They don't have to be an expert on the topic by any means, but just a genuine interest and a passion to some extent for the project. Um, and let's see, cross disciplinarity, like cross disciplinary flexibility, is also really important, specifically in the context of a think tank, or I guess you could say academia adjacent context, because oftentimes you're working with researchers that don't come from your same field. I mentioned that I work with economists. I also work with public health researchers as well as people from education. And so we all have our own disciplinary backgrounds, but we've been able to be flexible enough with each other and I guess curious enough to engage with each other in a way that is not so rigid when it comes to those disciplinary boundaries. And then I would say too, relationship building skills is really important. And I think that's also something that is important across careers, like I mentioned. It's important when we're doing research, whether it's in the context of collecting survey data or interview data. Like it's just genuinely important, and engaging with various stakeholders at different levels, maybe to be able to access certain data. So it's important to be able to build relationships in a way that is not transactional but authentic and ethical.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic to hear about, some of these skills that are translational, and to help us get a sense of where, you know, what's useful for students as they graduate from the classroom. But in that same vein, I asked about assessments and like how does this inform assignments and things like this. And I wondered, Jennifer, if you could talk about what assessment of research and assessment of the research you're doing looks like in your field and how it might vary from the classroom. Right, we're not looking for always having the right answers, but what does this look like? So we have a sense of like how we might model assessment for our students to prepare them for this next stage.
That's a really great question. So, and I don't know that I have like a perfect answer for this, but I think what we really do a lot of at IWPR is kind of debriefing about like after a research project thinking about like, okay, so what did we find in this? What were we hoping to find? Did we achieve this goal? But also that requires like going into the project, knowing what those goals are. Um, and sometimes those are tied to funders, right? So you might have a funder deliverable that you're trying to meet. And funder deliverables often require that you do that type of reflection at the end of a project where you assess kind of like what you learned, what you could have done better. You think about how your research findings can be applied broadly. You think about the impact of your research. Those are the kinds of ways I would say that we mostly assess um, our work. So it's not like an exam or anything like that, but more so like, what is the impact of this? What are the broader implications of these findings? How can specific stakeholders use these findings, like policymakers? We think a lot about that because we engage a lot with the Hill. Um, how can the media use these findings? How might these findings be interpreted by different parties, right? I know, something like to be real in this political environment, you have to think about how might your findings be co-opted by, I don't know, somebody on the far right or something like that in a way that you didn't intend. So that's why we do these things called meetings of the minds at the beginning of projects where we bring in various stakeholders across the organization. That helps us to really map out a project, but then checking in with each other throughout the project to think about if we need to course correct something or change our direction. And then, of course, again, checking in at the end of the project as well.
Thank you very much. So this has been such a great discussion, and I feel like we've gotten so many important insights about what it looks like to be teaching methods, and how we can be attending to the needs of the diverse publics that we're working with, and then also thinking about the futures of these students. At this time, I'd like to give our attendees an opportunity to ask our panelists any questions. I know that I have follow-up questions, but if anyone wants to drop it into the chat, we have that function. And we do have one. So we'll go ahead and start with this. And as we're answering these questions, please feel free, everyone, to drop more in. So we have, I would love to hear more about whether the panelists think that methods courses help us engage questions of equity, especially in this political environment. And then let's start there. I think these next two, the follow-up questions are a little bit different. So how methods courses help us engage questions of equity.
I don't know, like I guess I'll jump in. And then yeah, I think we both kind of like, even though we're Dr. Vanessa is quantitative more so, and I'm more qualitative. We both talked a lot about positionality. We both talked a lot about critical thinking. And those are really important things for students, skills for students to develop, to engage with the world. And you can see in this political environment that a lot of those skills are lacking, especially in the social media age where there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. Helping students be more critical about um, the questions they're asking, the information that they're consuming, because regardless of what career students go into, they're going to be consumers of knowledge and consumers of information, and sometimes producers of knowledge. So I think all of the questions and things that we grappled with today are really helpful for helping students to develop those skills, especially in this political environment.
I think that's a great point, and I really appreciate the broader implications that Jennifer has been sharing this whole time, thinking about critical thinking, etc. So important. I will also just add maybe like a little bit more specifically in terms of like how methods helps us with equitable things in addition to like critical thinking and all that. I'll talk specifically from like a quant perspective that sometimes we will discuss different forms of inequity, but it's harder for some people to grapple with that unless they have statistics that seem to back that up. Again, take it with a grain of salt because you never know you have to consider who the funders are and the questions, etc. However, there seems to be a greater level of understanding when you can say X% of the population experiences this, or 1 in 5 people go through this. And so I think that statistics can help us shed light on things that some of us might already be aware of this information, but just being able to like add some numbers behind it I think leads the broader public and population to see it as more credible. And I'm not saying that that's how it should be, but I think that that's how it is currently. So I think that it makes it a little bit less disputable, although we can still again dispute. But I think it makes it less disputable to say these are the statistics behind it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, specifically for Jennifer, how does a methods training in sociology specifically, how do you feel that that helps you engage across disciplines in these more applied fields?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I really love about sociologists and sociology in general, and why I really like being a sociologist is that we think about people and like why the work we do, the topics we study matter to people. I find sometimes when engaging with scholars of different disciplines, depending on what it is, that they might be thinking about the statistics or the numbers or a particular concept or something, but not so much thinking about how this thing affects people in their everyday lives or how people make decisions in their everyday lives and what factors come into play when people make decisions. And so I just really like that sociology gives us that keen ability to do that in a way that scholars from other fields might not be able to, or may not necessarily be able to, but their disciplines don't necessarily give them the skills to be able to do that in the same way. So I find that it helps to kind of create a more well-rounded research team, especially when you have people from different, specifically social science fields.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I love the people aspect for sure. Um, and then for Vanessa, could you say more about how you get students to think critically? How do you communicate in a research class a crit quant sensibility? And then how do you balance hard skill training with that sensibility?
Yeah, for sure. So when I'm thinking about having my students think critically, what my goal is for them to not just see a number and say, okay, I guess that's what the number is. I want them to think about how we got to this number, percentage, coefficient, whatever. How do we get there? And maybe the way that a question was asked impacts the way that people respond. So, like I mentioned, having students start by thinking about their own positionality and engaging in critical reflexivity. That's a literal assignment I have them do very early in the semester. Then I share information from different scholars on how to come from a quant crit perspective. They are not required to do that in their lives, but for this classroom, this is the perspective that we're coming from. So I have them read, but if sometimes students will read, but if you don't then have them do some about it, and maybe my group members might have a different something rationale. And so that allows students to have their own perspective shared, to work in a group and think about what their group members think about how to ask a question. It also allows students who are witnessing it to see different perspectives of, oh, I wouldn't have thought of doing it that way. Oh, that's interesting. So those are different ways of engaging in critical thinking because it leads students to recognize that there are different ways to approach the same question or the same information. And when thinking about how to balance with students engaging in Stata using the example data sets that Stata provides. So we're all on the same page. There's like 10 variables in this example data set, et cetera. So we're starting easy, right? Or not, I'll say we're starting with the limited data set. After that, after they built up certain skills, measures of association, measures of dispersion, et cetera, after we built some skills, then I'll move on to a ICPSR data set, Inter-University Consortium of Political and Social Research data set that I provide for them, that I've already gone through and seen there's lots of variables that could be of interest, that are different levels, that are pretty clean. And so I will provide them with that. So then they have practiced downloading that data set and using a much larger data set and having the opportunity to have different questions answered. And then for the last unit of our class, they can choose whatever data set they want. So some students, if they're working on their master's, for example, they'll use their thesis data set for the remainder of the semester. Or some students might be interested in criminal justice. So they'll choose a data set that's focused on criminal justice, or some might be focused on LGBTQ plus folks. And so they'll choose a data set that has a good number of variables with that. So in that way, we're building skills, and students at the end of like the last third of class have the opportunity to then engage in whatever research they're super interested in after having built up the skills together first. And at that point in time, they've already thought about their own critical reflexivity. They've already thought about um, the importance of how questions are asked and who's funding the research. And I will ask them when they choose a data set to share this information. Who funded it? How many people are in the data set? Was anyone dropped? What was the response rate, etc. And so those are ways that I will connect the skill training with the quant crit perspective.
Thank you so much for that. That's a great concrete example of the ways that you're doing that in the classroom. Um, we've got some more questions coming in. So we have one from Joan. How do you talk with students about AI use in research, and how do you see it as being related to public sociology? And, how is AI infiltrating other areas that's outside of the classroom as well? So how can we be preparing students for AI? And that was my addition. I am interested in this extension from this question as well. If we want to start with Vanessa about the classroom, and then maybe Jennifer, if you could talk about AI.
Yeah, it's a super interesting and important question. And I literally like exhaled as I read it. I was like, oh, because it's something we have to talk about. I'm still grappling with it. I'm still thinking about how to do it. So at my institution, for example, we are required to have an AI usage statement. And so there's a great variation in terms of professors' perspectives of AI, but we all have to say what our perspective is for the classroom. So you could say any form of AI is totally fine in this class. You could say absolutely none of it is fine. I'm in the middle. And so on my syllabi, I explicitly say like you can use things like Grammarly to like help with grammar and word sentence structure, etc. But please do not use any generative AI such as ChatGPT. Please don't use anything that generates information for you, because the goal of this is for you to be coming at this creatively on your own. However, I understand that there might be differences in terms of like, for example, maybe for some people English isn't their first language, and so I think that it's very it makes a lot of sense to use things like Grammarly or literally just spell check, which is kind of like a form of AI. So I think that that's fine with me, because I don't want to have students not use these tools that are available. But at this point in time, I don't want students to be using generative AI in the classroom. However, people approach this very differently. So that's my personal specific approach at this point in time. And my rationale, again, is to make sure that students are creating their own sentences and are coming to this on their own. However, there can be very creative uses of AI too that I may not be as aware of. And so my position might change in the future, but that's where I am at this point in time.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Vanessa. Like, it's still something that I'm grappling with. It's still something that we as an institution are grappling with. And we know that AI is being used in research in a lot of new and creative ways. Like, for example, I mentioned earlier Deduce, which is a qualitative data analysis software. They just kind of recently implemented an AI tool that can help you to analyze qualitative data. So, like, no matter how you feel about AI isn't going anywhere. And I also like that Vanessa kind of noted, like, we tend to think of just like chat gpt and things like that, but grammarly is ai, right? Like so I guess we have to kind of think, define what we mean by it and what types we're thinking about, like be more specific about it. Are we talking about generative ai? Like what type of ai are we talking about? And then developing kind of parameters around it, but also allowing space for creativity too. So yeah, because I don't have to grade papers or anything like that anymore, I don't think about it as not allowing people to use it, but maybe more like thinking critically about how we use it and engage with it, and using it to our advantage, like developing literacy around it.
I think that's a great, addition to the discussion that Vanessa had about it, that we're looking at this in the classroom as why are we using GAI? How would it help us in this sense? And, we're trying to create critical thinking and, come up and encourage students to do the work of doing the thought process. And that this is important because it does extend, this is these ideas of maintaining this critical thought process extends beyond just the classroom and just about being assessed on our work in a classroom setting. And I think having those conversations that Vanessa's talking about in the classroom, these two things complement each other. Thanks, y'all, for sharing those insights. We have another question. So thanks for all of your insight. And then I would love to hear your thoughts on bringing people onto research teams who have lived experiences in sensitive areas, um, including addiction, gender violence, etc. How can the value of lived experience effectively be explained to non-social scientists? I'm not sure, maybe Vanessa, you could pick up on, could start with this, and then again, we'll transition to Jennifer.
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. And even the idea behind it of like how can the value of lived experiences effectively be explained to non-social scientists? I even the idea that we have to explain it is a little bit frustrating, right? Like obviously their experiences matter. But I get your point, right? Of like if people are outside of academia, then people within academia or like on research teams might not necessarily immediately see their value. So honestly, I think that quant crit would be supportive of this too, if you're coming from a quantitative perspective, because I think that quant crit tries to turn on its head some of the ideas and framings of quantitative methods. So, for example, I believe that many quantitative methodologists feel that we can achieve objectivity and strive for a very objective approach. Whereas from a quant crit perspective, you might question that and say, well, we are all subjective and we all bring our own beliefs into the research that we do, the questions that we ask in the first place, the people that we talk to, the way that we analyze data, etc. And so if we're recognizing that maybe we can strive for objectivity, but we are all subjective, maybe that can help us think about the value of other people's perspectives and experiences. Because if I'm on a research team, but I'm studying a group of people that's outside of my own group, I'm bringing my own perspectives, beliefs, thoughts about that group into the research. And so it might be helpful to have information from people with those lived experiences while still recognizing, of course, that they would not be representative of everyone of their group. I think it's still helpful to think about, to recognize one's own subjectivity, which is why we get into this idea of positionality and reflexivity. in order to emphasize the usefulness, the utility, the significance, the importance of having people who have gone through some of these experiences be able to share information. Because they might say things like, hey, this question wording is actually super offensive. Or maybe you could frame this question in a different way. Or when you say it like this, I don't know what you mean when you ask me this. And so other people taking the survey might not understand what you're saying. And so as a researcher, it would be actually very helpful to have that understanding and to recognize like, okay, like the population that I would like to study is not receiving or not interpreting my questions the way that I'm interpreting them. That's super helpful information to know early on. So that would be actually very vital so that you're not misinterpreting data. So I would probably frame it in that way.
Yeah, I'll kind of echo what Vanessa said. I think that having researchers on our team that represent diverse perspectives and experiences is really important to help us frame questions, to maybe help some people of the research team kind of learn about what their blind spots might be when it comes to a certain topic. I just think it's important for a variety of reasons, even just for how we might approach the research process and or yeah, just a lot of things. Like there's so many different reasons. I think it's super important. And I think too, like Vanessa said, we always have to be mindful of our own subjectivity and positionality when approaching research. And another thing to think about too is like, for example, most of my research are women in some context. And if you're interviewing people, someone may not want to participate in a project that is about Black women, but not necessarily headed by a Black woman, or the interview talk to this person about my experiences. So just thinking even about things like that, like how that might affect the research process is really important.
Thank you both so much. This has been such an engaging conversation, and thank you to everyone who attended and your incredible questions. Um, I, at this point, we will kind of wrap up our conversation. I'll turn it over to Vanessa and Jennifer one more time if there's anything they have left to say. But we at First Publix are so grateful that everyone was here today to join the conversation, that Jennifer and Vanessa, that you took the time out to help provide insight. And our one of our graduate team members has sent a message about a feedback poll. So please take 1 to 2 minutes to fill that out for us. Give us an idea of where to go next. And again, thank you so much. But yes, Jennifer, Vanessa, is there anything else you'd like to leave us with?
I would just like to close out by saying thank you all so much for organizing and hosting this session. I really enjoyed having the opportunity to participate and also being able to hear Jennifer's perspective as well. I really enjoyed like hearing the differences that we had when we were thinking about our approach to these, but also I think the commonality and the overlap that we had too. So that was super interesting just for me as well. So thank you all so much for being here.
Yes, thank you. This was such a great conversation. Thank you so much for organizing this, First Publix, and for inviting me.
Thank you both. Be on the lookout for content related to this webinar on our website. That'll come up in the next few weeks. And at this point, we'll say thank you and goodbye. Stay tuned.